Hello again, book lovers, and here I'm talking about White Gold by Giles Milton, who, I'd forgotten, wrote, among many other books, another book that I enjoyed, Nathaniel's Nutmeg, the race to the South Seas to get the prized spices from the Spice Islands. Also, I will recommend in passing, and recommend White Gold beyond a shadow of a doubt. It fulfills my criteria of being a ripping yarn while being true and, as usual, superbly researched, this time very much from unpublished manuscripts, many of them from the subject of this kind of biography, Thomas Pellow, who was taken as a slave by the Moroccans. So, in the nature of these books, we will get a lot of background history, and so we should, and so we do. Now, I had no intention of setting out on a trilogy of horror porn, but after the shenanigans in native Indian territory and Moll being transported off to America, here we are again with another tale of slavery, and slavery is the centre point of this. This is a time when, we tend to forget, people who sailed the seas near southern England, Cornwall, Ireland, as far up as Iceland and Newfoundland, ran the risk of being captured by the Barbary pirates, as they were known, the Salé corsairs, as they came from this port known as Salé. I should give a trigger warning yet again. There are many, many descriptions of horrific punishments, tortures, conditions of life, and the quite unbelievable behaviour of one of these despots. In this case, we're talking about Mulai Ismail and his slaves, who he has build enormous walls and then knock them down again because he doesn't like them, who he would sometimes just, rather like the Nazis did in their death camps, just kill people on a whim, or maybe have them tortured to death on a whim. I'm always struck by these kinds of scenario, but how things actually got done. I can understand there was a trickle down of terror that meant that if you didn't obey, something horrible would happen to you. How did they actually oversee all these things? They managed to keep thousands of slaves working. They did this in part by training black slaves who they'd nicked from sub-Saharan Africa and bringing them up from children to be the most sadistic kind of order follower that you could imagine. So you didn't want to end up in their hands. The actual story of Thomas Pellow is unbelievable. He nearly dies so many times that you can't help but wonder what guardian angel finally saw him home. Because he does get home after 23 years. But that's no spoiler. The amount of adventures along the way will keep you riveted, as I say, as if it were a novel. Once we get into the story of the actual what happened next to Thomas, as he tried to escape, as he was betrayed, as he was set upon by thieves. He was actually promoted to be one of the guards of the harem of the Sultan at one point. And he is under strict instructions not to let anybody pass. And if anybody persisted, that he was to shoot the musket through the door at whoever it was, even though the door didn't have any openings. That was what your instructions were. So one night, who should come but the Sultan himself, and demand to be let in. This guy will just... He had two people sawn in half, vertically. One from the bottom, one from the top, just to give you an idea of something that might occur to him and be put into practice. So there's Mr. Pellow, young lad still. He was taken aged 11, he'd be about 16 as this happened, guarding the door. You can hear it's the Sultan saying, "I'm going to get you, lad, you've made a terrible mistake. Let me in, let me in." Did he let him in or no? Well, there's a nice little hook for you to read the book, isn't it? Of course, that would have massive consequences. What was the correct decision? White Gold is the title of Mr. Milton's tome, and serves to remind us that, yes, it wasn't just blacks who were put into terrible conditions of slavery, left to rot in their own filth with tiny rations of bread and water, 150,000 at a time in cells of maybe 100, 150. Actually, numbers, I should say, nobody knows for sure, but let's say a 25,000 average of slaves just being kept in these horrible pits, probably in Algeria, in Tunis, Tripoli, as well as this part of Morocco, and a constant stream of slaves. Now, if they decided to, after having been beaten to within an inch of their lives, if they at that point converted to Islam, they became known as renegados, these renegades that would never have any chance of being redeemed, because backstage there are, not with George I, who wasn't at all interested, it seems, but with later kings and parliamentarians, the great efforts. The sad story of Mr. Solly Coffre, who really wanted to free as many of the slaves as he could, but had a failed first mission and was criticised for the price he paid on the second mission. Then we get Captain Pellow, who finally brings down Algiers and stops the slave trade. Pellow, in fact, was distantly related to Pellow, and, as I say, the terrible story of what might happen to some of these white Christians who would be taken to Moorish lands and live out a hell. So there is this racial angle to it, and you could almost see it as a counterweight to the narrative that now just links the slave trade to the exportation of black slaves from Africa to America. All this was going on at the same time, and even within this knotted fabric we find some anti-black racism. We find the fact that some of these English politicians didn't seem to think there was anything to look at really in terms of shipping those blacks over into America, but having the white Christian slaves was intolerable. And then you get the fact that the English ambassadors made these inroads and tried to get the slaves freed. They wouldn't free the renegades because they'd converted, even though they'd been bastinadoed into doing so, and very often there was no improvement in your conditions for doing it anyway. But anyway, they had to say goodbye to their native land forever, except in a few instances. They weren't going to get rescued, nor were the Spanish or the Portuguese or the Italians or the Icelandic. It was all by nationality. A lot of French were there as well. And in the end, the French played a large part in the rescue of some of the slaves. And there's also one point when Pellow is offered a wife. They all seem to share traits, these mad despots. One of them is marrying people off. So they all stand in the parade ground, and Pellow really objects to being married off to a black woman. The Sultan is curiously modern in his view of race equality, it seems, as he likes to pair blacks and whites together to get a sort of mulatto staff. And he himself, among his harem of thousands and thousands and thousands of wives, in inverted commas, was not fussy at all, let's put it that way. So there's all kinds of racism going on. I'm sorry you're not English, we can't rescue you. I'm sorry you're not French, you have to stay behind in the stinking dungeon. Later sultans began to realise that it's a bit more diplomatic to actually stick to your treaties, and the corsairs, the Sally Rovers, finally disappeared. But this is just the bare bones of the book, the adventures that this guy undergoes, the background that Giles Milton gives, and the idea of living under one of these omnipotent lunatics on whose whim so many people's fates depended. As you may have guessed by now, I like to have 2 or sometimes 3 books on the go and dip in and out as I feel attracted to each one. This one, I have to say, I put the others aside and rifle through it. And even, sort of spoiler alert, has a happy ending.